Uplift Church and all those join us for our uh, Revelation Bible study. We've been doing this on Wednesday nights for the past several weeks, and tonight is part 15. As we look into Revelation chapter 17 and Revelation chapter 18. And as you get on this evening, I just want to kind of go ahead and uh, sum up a little bit about where we've been through all this. Um, It has been an amazing journey through Revelation as we have started out from this introduction of John, who introduces himself. We also see the introduction of Jesus, and we see this conversation take place in which Jesus is giving John this vision. He first has a message to deliver to the churches. Once that happens, we see a completely and totally different shift happen. Now it's focused on this plan, God's plan. And through this, we've been able to see how God's hand through all this is perfectly orchestrated. Perfectly orchestrated. It's not chaos, it is completely organized. And that is something that really dawned on me as I was preparing for this week's lesson is that God knows exactly what he's doing. He has a plan. Despite our concerns or our ideas or even our worries, God has a plan. Now, as we look into tonight, there's something that I kind of want you to be thinking about. When I was I think a senior or maybe a junior in high school, we did this project for English class in which we were interviewing someone, maybe older, a friend or a relative of the family that might experience something a long time ago, whether it was through the Great Depression or earlier times growing up when maybe times were a little bit simpler. And through this, I learned a lot about uh, the Great Depression, the fall of the stock market, uh, when you think about gas being rationed, um, things were a lot different. When you start thinking about World War II and what was led through Adolf Hitler, I wonder how many times people thought, well, this is it. This is it. And as we start looking to Revelation, we see that God has a plan. He has a perfect plan. And what we're to do is to trust Him through it. Trust Him through the plan. Now remember, in Revelation chapter 4, the church has been raptured out. It's gone. So as we've been studying this is God's um, wrath. This is God's punishment that has been poured out onto the rest of the earth. Now, to show you where we're at in our timeline, because we're coming to the near the end of Revelation, we're nearly there. So congratulations for hanging with us during this entire time. But this is our timeline that we created in week 1, and we're right here. Last week we done these 7 files. We're right here, what's titled as these 7 dooms. We're going to talk about 2 of these dooms tonight in in chapter 17 and chapter 18. And these are probably some of the most difficult that we will study. And so I encourage you to go ahead and be read up on it. That way it would be somewhat familiar to you as we cover it. But I know that this is a lot. And so as you dive into this, you may have had questions. I think a lot of those are going to be answered tonight as we go through this study. I think this is going to be interesting and eye-opening at the same time. So as we dive into this, I just want you to understand that there is a lot of imagery here in these 2 chapters. And there's some things that are debated And so when I get to those parts, I'm going to tell you um, what most scholars think, and you can draw up some of your own conclusions. But this is what, after research and study, this is also what I've come to believe as well. So, Revelation chapter 7. And in my Bible, it has an interesting title. And so your Bible may be having like headlines and titles in that. So in Revelation chapter 7, mine is titled The Great Whore and the Scarlet Beast. Now, that grabs your attention there, doesn't it? Well, when this kicks off in Revelation chapter 1, uh, we see that John is here and that these seven angels have come up. And one of these seven angels, which had the seven vials, said, talked with him and said, come hither, and I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. And this is part of this imagery. See, this great whore is one of the things that has been talked about last week, Babylon. And basically what this is saying is that judgment is here for Babylon. And you're going to see later here is that it's also referred to as the woman. So there's two aspects to this, two sides to this. There is Babylon, the economic side, the commercial side, and there's the Babylon, the religious side. And so if you remember a few weeks prior to that, we talked about how this satanic system came up and the mark of the beast, and that the mark of the beast is more about an act of worship, a way of pledging your allegiance to this beast. And so with this angel invites John to see this come to pass, to see this happen. And verse 2, it lets you a little bit on, look, the idea of this. It says, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. And so what this is, it's signifying that the Bible has signified this a lot with the idea of fornication or this great whore as a false religion, a false worship. And so when you see that, you need to bring your attention automatically to that. Because what this is setting up a mimic of Christianity, a mimic of God's divine plan in which he has set in place. In verse 3, you see that the woman had 7 heads and 10 horns. Well, this woman is a city, Babylon. Now, I got to ask, why don't they just say it's a city? So, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But I do know that John starts asking this exact same question. He didn't quite fully understand, and you're going to see this. If you've already read it, you know where we're going at. Well, with the 7 hands and 10 horns, it tells us this is a direct connection that she is integrated in with the beast and his system, his kingdom that he has established. And it is false, it's anti-God, and this religious system and practice goes right along with Satan. And this is a power-hungry city, and it's given that image like in verse 3 in the idea of this imagery. Look at verse 3. So he carried me away in the spirit, and I saw the woman sit upon the scarlet colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And so just talking about the power that it has. But in verse 4, this gets interesting. It says, and the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, and full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. Now again, this is not talking about a specific woman. This woman is representing this city of Babylon. And what's getting ready to happen in verses 5 and 6? We'll just look at verse 6. And it says, I saw the woman drunken with the blood of saints, with the blood of martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. Now, This woman was utterly evil. And again, this woman is this city. And what they have allowed into this religious practice was nothing but completely against God and all about this religious practice. And this religious practice was all about yourself and this beast. And what's interesting is that John said that he looked up with admiration. Now, it's not that he was admiring her, admiring this city, but almost astonished at the deception and how far from God this was, but how many people had bought into it. And you're going to see how they did this because it's amazing. Look at the angel's question to John in verse 7. So then the angel said, "Wherefore did thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman and the beast that carried her, which had the 7 heads and 10 horns." And so this is key, is verse 7, because here the question is going to be answered. What in the world is this vision that John has just seen? He's marveling, he's looking, he's just astonished at what's taken place, what he has seen. In church, what this is, this woman, look at verse 8. "And the beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life." Repeat, were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. Now, this religious system, this practice, represents an apostate religion system that will combine all different forms of religion, even spiritualism and humanism, into one big satanic practice. Almost even magical. Now, you may have read that in verse 8, and it talks about this, the beast. And this is this connection that this religious practice and this beast have. And it uses words in here like the beast that was and is not and yet is. Again, this is highly debated. So, again, I'm going to tell you that this is what I've come to my belief on what this represents. And also, this is where a lot of scholars have cited as well. So I just want to make that clear up front. But in verse 8, this is telling us there's a religious so closely mimicking what God has established that people will fall for it. That this beast that we're referred to here, which is the Antichrist, okay, will actually be resurrected. Who was, is not, and yet is. That they're going to be a resurrection, and it's going to be so convincing, so mimicking close to what God did, that people will fall for it and they'll believe it because they'll have just enough Bible, just enough knowledge that they're going to fall for this. And so this woman in this partnership with Antichrist, this partnership lasts for 3.5 years. And then it turns. It turns. And when it turns, it's because the beast is turning on it because he wants all the glory for himself and nothing else. He's going against it because it too closely represents God. And so the beast that we see here is the same beast that we saw in chapter 13 just a few weeks ago. And this, again, this is the Antichrist. And people are going to believe on him as a god. But I want to draw your attention to something that's said here, is that in verse 8, it says about, and go into perdition. This is the state, perdition is the state of eternal punishment and damnation. So that's what is, that is the goal. That is the end goal that's going to happen here. And so what you're seeing here being established during this time of tribulation is not only is there going to be worldwide peace, but there's going to be a one world religious system that people are going to be following here. Now, with this, there's still going to be people that will not give in. Remember, we've talked about them. They're the ones who they're not taking the beast, the mark of the beast. They will not bow down. Many of them have already been killed for their beliefs. But it's going to be very challenging during this time because remember, they're not going to be able to purchase or sell any items. But again, it's to show their belief. Now you get to verses 9 and 10, and it talks about again these 7 heads, or in this case, 7 mountains. And again, this is heavily debated, but what most people believe that this is that they represent these seven heads represent the 7 mountains or the 7 hills of Rome. You can look that up as well, and they're very well known in Rome. What happened to Rome? Well, it fell. This is representing a kingdom that's established like that. So this Rome-like kingdom, what Babylon is. And it says that 5 have fallen. Okay, so this was predicted back in Daniel. And so we see that 5 have fallen, and here's going to be established. And in verse 11, we see that what the Antichrist is going to do, it says that he'll be the 8th. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7, and going to perdition. So, again, what people believe is it's going to be a system that's going to be set up, an empire that's set up like the Roman Empire, so it's going to kind of be established. And the Roman Empire was all about Rome. They had an allegiance system. They wanted everyone's allegiance, and it was all about them. So this kingdom, this Babylonish kingdom that's going to be established is going to be all about Satan, deception. Verse 12, again, I told you this was really deep in a whole lot of stuff. So in verse 12, it explains that these 10 horns represent 10 more kings. And what these 10 kings are going to do, you can see that in verses 13 and 14. They are going to give power to the beast. So they're going to establish him and give him power. But what they're going to do in verse 14 is to make war with the Lamb. Now we know this is Jesus, and it's setting up what's getting ready to take place next week. In verse 15, it says, talks about the harlot again, about this religious system, that she's going to have so much influence over the world. Now I see that Rhonda asks, is this that new world religion? Yes, and it's going to be power and influence over the whole entire world. But in verse 16, you'll see that Satan is going to get rid of her. Going to get rid of her. Now, I'm going to try to sum up chapter 17 because I know that we talked a lot about description. There's a lot of imagery here, and I really wanted to hit that. But I want to kind of sum this up. In the last days, there's going to be a one world church formed. And this one world church, that's the harlot, okay, will be involved in political and economic affairs of the world, and will, with help of the beast, will become a great power. A great power. And this beast is going to get support of 10 kings. These are going to be 10 kings that's going to be regionally positioned there, and they're going to support this one world system and the beast. A union is going to exist between all these nations and the beast and this church. And the scene that chapter 7 that it established takes place in the first 3.5 years. And with this, we see that it's in the middle of the tribulation. And this is very important, that the true character of Satan has yet to be revealed. So during the middle of this, he is going to want full power for himself. And he's going to get this out of the way. Look at verse 17, and then we'll move on to chapter 18. For God hath put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree, and to give their kingdom unto the beast, until the word of God shall be fulfilled. God has a plan. Follow me there? God has a plan. All right, now if you look over at chapter 18, this is not as heavy as chapter 17. I know there's a whole lot in there. I know there's a whole lot there. So don't worry about that. You look at chapter 18, and you're going to see that this is a little bit more um, digestible. So in chapter 18, it's called out here that uh, in verses 1 through 3, this angel announces the fall of Babylon. Now, before, what we're seeing is the religious side of that falling. Now, what we're seeing is the commercial side of it falling. And so, with the religious system, the world can still kind of go on. Do you remember back in March when we had all this about essential and not? Well, there's some things that people think that are not essential that may be essential to others. But one thing that is essential is the commercial part, okay? Trade, being able to buy and sell. And what this angel announces, verses 1 through 3, look at verse 2. It uses the words, fallen is fallen. Did you see that? And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, is fallen. And so this is dual judgment on Babylon, this kingdom that Satan has established. So the economic side and the religious side. Verse 3 is important. For all nations have drunk the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies. Through chapter 18, there's a lot of imagery to things or possessions. They, again, all about Rome. They were all about themselves. Now, Larry asked on here, could this point to the Vatican? It very well could. It very well could, because there's going to be so much that it's going to be tied to this region. In verse 8, there's a call of God out of here, because some of God's people are in this city, and he's calling them, he's wanting them out to be. Look at verse 4. It says, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out of her, my people, that ye not be partakers of her sins, that ye receive not of her plagues. And so there are still people that are dedicated to God surviving this. That should give us encouragement. Again, God has a plan. God has a plan. Verse 7 tells us, it's a detail about how the world glorified in self. It said how much she glorified herself and lived deliciously. So much torment and sorrow to give her, for she saith in her heart, I sit a queen, am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. All about the queen, all about her, all about this city, is all about itself. And so in verse 9 through 19, there's two groups of individuals you see here that go into a mourning over this city. Verses 9 and 10, we see the kings of the earth. Remember, I just talked about those 10 kings. There are specific regions there, and they're going to give allegiance and power and authority to the Antichrist. But then we also see, starting with verse 11 through 19, we see merchants of the earth. But I want to call your attention to verse 9. Let's read it. And the kings of the earth who have committed fornication and lived deliciously with her shall bewail her and lament for her when they shall see the smoke of her burning. So with this, what they're seeing the destruction of this city, and they are in lament for her. This is a passionate grief. Like their livelihood is falling apart because the commercial side is now up in smoke with her. Now, the only thing that I can compare this to is when you saw the Twin Towers and all the dust and the rubble and the fires, and it smoked for hours, weeks. Smoked. If you can just think of that. Now think of a whole city. And here these merchants are looking afar off. And they cried. Look at verse 18 and 19. It says, and they cried when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, what city is like unto this great city? See how embedded they were? They were all about this city because the city was all about themselves. Very dangerous. Verse 19, and they cast dust on their heads and cried and weeping and wailing, saying, alas, alas, that great city, wherein we were made rich, all that had ships in the sea, by the reason of her caution, for in 1 hour she made desolate. So in the span of 1 hour. So basically, this city was brought down, not just to its knees, but destruction in a short amount of time. And its effects were felt because this city had been idolized, and so many other regions had dedicated itself to it. These kings had surrendered power, and now it's gone. Now, we see a different side in verse 20. Look at verse 20 with me. Rejoice over her. I'm sorry. Rejoice over her, thou heaven, and ye holy apostles and prophets, for God hath avenged you on her. What did we say at the beginning of this? God has a plan. Verse 21, and a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and cast into the sea, saying, thus with violence shall that great city Babylon be thrown down, and shall be found no more at all. Now this stone, this millstone that's being cast in, that's just showing the suddenness of God's judgment. So if you take a stone and you throw it into a lake, it just disappears. That's what we're seeing happen here. But I want you to look at verse 23. It says, verse 23, and the light of a candle shall shine no more at all in thee, and the voice of the bridegroom and of the bride shall be heard no more at all in thee. For thy merchants were great men of the earth, for by thy sorcerers are all nations deceived. Done. Verse 24, and in her was found the blood of prophets and saints and all that were slain upon the earth. Wow, that's what we're seeing here. And so what we can see through these verses here is that and shall be heard no more at all in the day for thee. It's done. No more, no more. It can be done no more. There's nothing that can be done to change it. It is being established. And what we just read through tonight in chapter 17 and 18 is two dooms, two falls. And we're seeing that is the fall of Babylon religious, this religious side, and also Babylon the commercial side. I spent more time talking about chapter 17 than the religious side because when you read Revelation chapter 17, there's so much imagery in that. But chapter 18 is a little bit more plain because what we're seeing is the city being destructed, the commercial side of it fall, and we're seeing how it's affected the kings, the political leaders during that time, but then also the commercial side of it when it's affecting even the merchants. There's no ports for boats to come into. And even if they could come into, there's nowhere for them to sail. It's destroyed. And so this is affecting everything. And so during this time of this tribulation, so much is going to be hindered and surrounded by this false establishment that Satan has put in place. What did we say? God has a plan. Now, my last note says this. All that is remaining is for Christ to come and destroy its armies. So in chapter 17, we saw that these kings and all were coming to fight against Jesus. What's happening next? Well, what's happening next is pretty awesome. You're going to get to see that because we're going to see the coming of Christ and Armageddon. So that's getting ready to happen next. So what I encourage you to do for next week is read up on chapter 19 in the book of Revelation. We're actually going to look at our book that we've been going through, Max Lucado's Life Lessons from Revelation. It doesn't talk about the entire chapter, but we're going to go into that because it's got some great stuff in it. But we're going to be looking at our book. So I encourage you to read chapter 19 of Revelation and look at our book because lesson 9, it's titled, we'll give you a spoiler, The Defeat of Devil. I'm sorry, the Defeat of Evil. It's some good stuff, and it's going to be great. So Revelation chapter 19 for next week, we're going to be looking at our book. Let me close tonight by saying this. There's been a lot of questions over the past several months, pretty much since March, about the end of times, what's going to take place, what's going to happen. But let me reassure you what the Bible says. No man knows when that time is. Nobody knows but one. So us as Christians, we have a responsibility. For one, we need to trust in God's plan. Not worry, but trust in God's plan. but we also have a great responsibility to share what we do have. Instead of being negative and sharing sorrow or stress, we should be sharing joy, Jesus. That's the hope. It's not any political person. The hope that we have is in Jesus. And it's because of Jesus the reason why we can go through the study of Revelation and be at peace and actually find joy through this. And even amongst all this destruction that's taken place and through Revelation, we see that God still has a plan. And there's people who have not bowed down to Satan, but their allegiance is to God. That gives me hope and encouragement that God has a plan. Even when the world still may be in chaos and we don't understand, God has a plan. So what do? We prepare, we plan, we make necessary arrangements. But church, we should be sharing joy in Jesus. And I encourage you, as you spend the rest of your week and prepare for worship on Sunday, that you make it a priority, an opportunity to share joy in Jesus. I hope you've enjoyed our Bible study tonight. If you have any other questions, please post them on here in these comments and I'll get to them. Let me just make sure I see. Yes, Rhonda, that was that New World, that One World Church, that religion. Yes. And Larry put on there, could this be point to the Vatican? And yes, it most definitely could. And the Vatican is this city. It's surrounded by Rome. It's Italy, and that's where a lot of people think. The other thing about it is that's where the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church. So there's a lot of other things going to play right there. So this could be that. It may be something else. There's not 100% sure what that is, but could it be? It absolutely could be. Guys, I hope you've enjoyed our Bible study tonight. If you have any questions, please post them on here. We'll get to them. I hope you've enjoyed it. Revelation 19 next week. Hope you have a great night. Good night. God bless you all.